Today we're going to look at Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all in one sermon. And so I want you to kind of fasten your seatbelts. The reason we're doing this is we're preparing for next week to start a new adventure. It's an adventure in the book of Joshua, where we'll spend about 16 weeks in Joshua. But to understand Joshua, you've got to realize that Joshua is actually bringing about the fulfillment of God's promise. You see, God made a promise to Abraham, and we learned a word last week. It's the word berit, that the covenant. God is a covenant God. He likes to make covenants. He made a covenant with Adam. He made a covenant with Noah, and he made a covenant with Abraham. The covenant was this: Abram, I'm going to bless you and make your name great. Everyone who blesses you, I'll bless them. And because of you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. He promised him to make his name great, that his descendants would be more numerous than the sand on the seashores. And he reaffirmed that covenant not just to Abraham, but to Isaac and to Jacob and to Joseph. And so last week we looked at the book, and that really is a good outline. After the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, which tell us about creation and the flood and the Tower of Babel, chapters 12 through the end of Genesis, 50 chapters, it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And God is a God who makes covenants. God is also a God who keeps his covenant. We learn the word chesed. The word chesed is a word about covenant faithfulness. And so we know God is not only a God who makes covenants which advance the interest of another person, but God is a God who's faithful. Even when people aren't faithful, God is faithful. But as we went clear through the book of Genesis and we got to the closing verses of the book of Genesis, we realized that really we found ourselves in a quandary. God's promises had not yet been fulfilled. We understand that by the time we get to the end of the book, the promise is unresolved. The children of Israel actually are living in the land of Egypt. And rather than being a great multitude, we remember there's just a handful. There's 12 sons that have gone and they've moved down to Egypt. And that's where the book of Genesis closes. I've got to tell you, the book of Exodus takes up the story. And however, we're going to find out that in the book of Exodus, we read as soon as we get to the 6th verse, there arose a king who knew not Joseph. And here's the problem. The children of Israel, they're not living in the promised land, they're living in Egypt. And the problem is, all of a sudden, there's a Pharaoh who doesn't acknowledge who even Joseph was. The children of Israel are multiplying. In fact, we do realize this part of the promise has come true. They went into Egypt, just a handful of people. But by this time, Exodus chapter 1, the children of Israel have reached a number of 600,000 men. Now you start multiplying that by women and children, you realize the children of Israel have grown to about 2 million. And this scares Pharaoh to death. They're going to overpower us. They're going to take us over. Not realizing what Joseph had done for them, he actually puts restrictions on the children of Israel. Worse than that, he forces them into servitude, slavery, and he starts killing every male child. And that's where we find ourselves in the book of Exodus. And so we find this story where they're forced into hard labor and the boys are being killed, but God raises up a deliverer. A little boy, 3 months old. Mom and Dad, we don't even know their names. Mom makes a basket out of papyrus and goes and puts their little 3-month-old son in the Nile River. They're watching from a distance, and Pharaoh's daughter comes along and sees this boy in the basket, and she takes him as her own. Gives him a name. You know, of course, the deliverer. The name is simply this: I drew him out of water. Or you might say it this way: his name is Moses. And so it's interesting that she actually commissions a young girl, hey, go find a nursemaid, and actually Moses is going to be cared for by his sister and his mother, but Pharaoh's daughter raises Moses as her own, raises this child up in the finest courts that are available in the courts of Pharaoh himself, and Moses is trained in Egyptian ways. Later in life, he actually sees a time when a Egyptian is actually treating a Hebrew slave poorly, and Moses, in rage, kills the Egyptian. He thinks he gets away with it. He thinks that nobody saw what's going on, but later on when he's in a confrontation with a Hebrew, the Hebrew says, what, are you going to kill me too? And he realizes that he had not got away with this murder, and so Moses actually flees from Egypt. He flees to the land of Midian. At that time, Pharaoh finds out and says, I'm going to kill Moses. And so he's escaped. He's fled to another country, and it's there as he's out in the country that he comes across this well, and he actually rescues some girls. Well, these girls happen to be the daughters of Jethro. Now, just so you're not confused, his last name's not Clampett, okay? And so that's not the same ones. But he rescues these daughters, one of whom he actually falls in love with, and he marries Jethro's daughter, Zipporah. And so we find Moses not in Egypt any longer, but the children of Israel, they still are in slavery, and they're praying out to God. And it's that time in the book of Exodus that actually God hears their prayers. Exodus chapter 2, verse 23, we find out that God hears the groans of the slaves in Egypt, and because of that, he remembers his promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he sets in motion a plan to rescue them. Exodus chapter 2. Well, at the same time, Moses is out in the wilderness. He's married. He's tending sheep, cattle, when something extraordinary happens, and you probably remember this story too. He comes across a bush, and the bush talks. Now, I don't know about you, but that might catch me just a little bit off guard. Not only does it talk, but the bush is being consumed by fire and yet not being consumed. It's burning, and yet it's not burning up. And that bush says to Moses, Moses, take off your sandals because the place you're standing on is holy ground. And so Moses does that. And God reveals himself to Moses at that time and says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back. I want you to go back to Egypt and set my people free. I want you to go back to the place where actually you're a wanted man, but that Pharaoh has now passed away. I want you to go back there and set my people free. And Moses, this great man, what does he do? He starts making excuses. And really, that's all they are. They're excuses. I don't know how to talk. Well, he's been trained to be a leader in the courts of Pharaoh. I'm not a great leader, but again, he's gone through all the schooling. He's been raised in that community. He makes all kinds of excuses, but they're just lame excuses. Finally, God reveals himself and says, I want you to go back and tell them who I am. Tell them that the I am sent you. And so Moses does. He goes back to Egypt. He's got a couple tricks that God has showed him. He's got a staff that when he throws the staff down, it turns into a snake. That's pretty impressive when he picks it up by the tail, a feat I don't want to try, but it becomes a staff again. He also has another trick. It's a miracle. He can put his hand inside of his cloak and pull it out, and it's leprous, and he can put it back in again, and the leprosy's gone. And so, hey, convincing miracles, right? He goes back to Pharaoh, and yet some way, by some means, we find out that the sorcerers in Egypt are able to kind of mimic these miracles, and so they're unconvinced. But Moses goes back, and in Exodus chapter 6, we realize that God makes a promise. He renews the covenant. Look, I'm going to remember my promise to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. I'm going to be your God. You will be my people. I'm going to take you to a land. I'm going to take you to a land that's going to be yours. And it's interesting that Pharaoh does not listen. The children of Israel don't even listen. In fact, really the children of Israel, they go back, and after these wondrous signs, the children of Israel actually start complaining against Moses. Moses, what are you doing? We kind of like it here in slavery. And Pharaoh gets mad, and so Pharaoh actually makes them work harder with less material. They have to work longer hours with less pay. And at that point, the children of Israel really start complaining. Moses, get out of here. What are you doing? You're messing up our life. And I've got to tell you, it's just a sign of things to come. God's renewing his promise with them. Moses is trying to deliver them, and yet the children of Israel, they simply complain. Of course, those miracles come to fruition in something that we call the plagues. Remember the 10 plagues? Actually, there's a song that says 7 plagues. Well, they can't count very well. There are 10 of them. And we read about the blood and the frogs. We read about the gnats and the flies and the livestock and the boils and the hail and the locusts and darkness that covers the land. And through it all, Pharaoh keeps changing his mind about, yeah, I will let him go, or no, I won't let him go. But finally it comes down to the culmination of the last plague, the death of the firstborn. And God institutes what we call Passover. Here's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to take a year-old lamb without any defect. And you've got to clean your house of leaven. You've got to go through all kinds of things. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to raise this little lamb in your house. And then at the point that I tell you what's going on, you're supposed to take the blood of the lamb and you're supposed to put it on your doorpost. And anyone that has the blood of the lamb on their door, the Lord will pass over that house. That's why we call it Passover. And so we get this last plague, the plague where everyone who's not covered by the blood of the lamb, the firstborn is killed in that household. And the Bible tells us that all of the Egyptians, there's not one family that does not suffer a loss because the death of the firstborn. And at that point, Pharaoh finally says, look, you go and you get out of here. We understand that at this point, those who are covered by the blood of the lamb, those who are passed over, they were able to leave Egypt. At that point, just imagine this. 2 million people leaving Egypt. They took the bones of Joseph. God leads them, and just imagine this. God leads them. At night, he leads with a pillar of fire. During the day, there's this presence, this cloud of God, and he leads them out of Egypt. They wander out of Egypt. They go down to the area that we'd call Sinai, and they go down through there, and on their way, Pharaoh has a change of heart. Pharaoh actually says, look, I'm going to go and get these guys. And he sends out, the Bible says, 600 of his finest chariots and then other chariots as well. And so he sends an army after them. And the children of